Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going dap on something I think we can all relate to. Trust.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we all kind of just take for granted.
But we're going to get in some really fascinating nuances here.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is we're going to be using this editorial overview from philosophical psychology as kind of our roadmap for this deep dive.
Okay.
And this overview is it's a tribute to Catherine Hawley, who was a philosopher who specialized in trust, really spent her career unpacking it.
Interesting.
And so this collection of articles kind of covers everything from trusting, your best friend to trusting entire institutions.
I mean, it really is incredible when you think about just how fundamental trust is. Like
Yeah.
in every aspect of our lives.
Right. Yeah. It comes up in our personal relationships, obviously,
Right.
but then also how we view, things like science and expertise. And this deep dive, I think it's going to take us on a journey through the value of trust, the ethical dilemmas of like trusting someone to help them become more trustworthy.
Mm.
And even how our understanding of trustworthiness plays out in things like, the COVID-19 pandemic.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty, can we just start with the basics?
Sure.
Like, how is trust different from simply relying on something? I mean, I rely on my coffee maker every morning to make my coffee.
Right.
But I wouldn't say I trust my coffee maker.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great starting point. I think what it highlights is that trust has this sort of added layer of vulnerability to it.
Right.
So, with trust, there's the risk of betrayal
Right.
that just isn't there with simple reliance. So, I mean, think about it this way. If you lend a treasured book to someone you trust and they spill coffee on it, it's not just that the book is damaged. It's
Right.
like, hey, I trusted you with this.
Yeah, there's that emotional sting
Exactly.
of like a betrayal.
Yeah. Or being let down.
Yeah, and I think that really gets to the heart of why trust is so ethically charged.
Yeah.
When we trust someone, we're not just saying they're competent,
Yeah.
right? We're making a judgment about their character. We're saying, they have goodwill. They're committed to us.
So when this editorial focuses heavily on trustworthiness, it's not just being academic.
Right.
It's really trying to get to like the core of like what makes trust matter so much in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. To figure out when trust is justified, we need to understand the qualities of the person or the institution that we're trusting. It's not enough to just feel trusting.
Right.
We have to sort of assess whether that trust is warranted.
So it's less about blind faith
Yeah.
and more about actually making informed judgments about who deserves our trust.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the consequences of sort of mismatched trust and trustworthiness can be really huge. I mean, think about like overworking yourself because you don't trust a colleague to pull their weight.
Yeah. Or the too much medicine problem in healthcare where patients are demanding unnecessary tests because they don't trust the doctor's judgment.
And those are just on an individual level.
Right.
But when you scale it up to society at large,
Yeah.
like we saw during COVID,
Oh, yeah.
the breakdown of trust can have like really, really serious consequences.
Right. I mean, think about the rise of vaccine hesitancy and conspiracy theories, right?
Yeah,
That
that's-
was fueled in part by distrust in institutions and experts, right? And it shows how fragile the fabric of society can be when that trust erodes.
Okay, so we've got like the foundation of trust and trustworthiness kind of laid out here.
Yeah.
But this editorial also dives into some pretty mind-bending philosophical puzzles about trust.
It does, yeah.
So what's the first one we should tackle?
Well, let's start with what's called trust's Meno problem. And it asks this deceptively simple but really tricky question.
Yeah.
If we can break down all the elements of trust, like competence, goodwill, all those things, what makes actually feeling trust more valuable than just acting as if we trust?
So like if I can perfectly mimic trustworthy behavior,
Yeah.
doesn't even matter if I genuinely feel it or not.
Right, exactly, yeah. But the philosopher Ross Patrizia, he argues that trust has this kind of inherent value because it's an ethical act in itself.
Okay.
So you can think about it this way, like if you constantly suspect your partner of cheating, even without evidence, you're essentially treating them as untrustworthy, right?
Right.
And that suspicion, it erodes the foundation of the relationship, even if you never voice it.
It's like you're denying them that basic respect
Exactly.
of believing in their good intentions.
Yeah, and it's about recognizing their inherent worth and their capacity for trustworthiness. And I think this gets even more complex when we think about something called therapeutic trust.
Therapeutic trust. Is that like trusting your therapist?
Not quite. It refers to cases where we trust someone to help them become more trustworthy.
Okay.
So, like, imagine a teenager who's constantly borrowing the car without asking. Instead of just saying no all the time, you entrust them with, like, picking up their younger sibling from school.
Okay.
Right. Hoping that this responsibility will help them develop a sense of reliability.
But how does that create a philosophical problem?
Well, it seems to kind of defy the typical logic of trust, right? You're trusting someone even though they haven't yet earned it, with the hope that your trust will help them grow.
So it's not just blind faith. It's like a deliberate act
Yeah,
with a specific goal in mind.
exactly. Yeah. And the philosopher J. Adam Carter, he calls this overriding therapeutic trust.
Right.
It's a unique category because you're kind of intentionally taking on a risk, even though the person might mess up,
Right.
in the hopes that it'll help them become more trustworthy.
So it's less about expecting someone to be perfect right now
Yeah.
and more about believing in their potential to become more trustworthy.
Exactly. And this brings us to another, I think, fascinating concept, which is the idea of domains of trust. This is the idea that trust is always specific to a particular context or activity.
Domains of trust. That sounds a little technical.
Yeah.
Can you just break that down a little bit?
Sure. I mean, think about it like this. You might trust your friend to be a great listener, but not to give you good financial advice.
Right.
Or, you trust your mechanic to fix your car, but not necessarily to bake a cake for your birthday.
Okay, yeah. So it's not just I trust someone generally.
Right.
It's I trust them for this thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and the philosopher Elizabeth Stewart, she highlights how mismatches in these domains of trust can cause all sorts of problems. So, imagine you ask a friend to house sit, and they end up rearranging all your furniture because they thought they were being helpful.
Oh, I can see how that would create some tension.
Yeah.
It's like I trusted you with my house, but not with my interior design choices.
Exactly, yeah. Or imagine you go to the doctor, right? And you assume that they can cure any illness. But they can't always deliver on that expectation. And so these kinds of mismatches, especially in expert layperson relationships, can lead to distrust and disappointment.
Well, this is really helpful. I'm thinking about all the times that I've felt let down
Yeah,
or confused in situations involving trust.
right.
And now I'm realizing it might be because those domains of trust weren't clearly communicated.
Yeah, and I think that's really Stewart's key point. Being explicit about these domains of trust can help us build and maintain healthier trust relationships. It's about setting clear expectations and boundaries.
Right from the start.
Yeah,
Okay, so this is all super fascinating.
yeah.
But I am wondering, how does power come into play when we talk about trust?
That's a great question. And it kind of leads us to one of the most, I think, critical aspects of this whole discussion, which is the concept of epistemic injustice.
Epistemic injustice. Okay, I'm intrigued, but I don't know what that means.
Yeah, so it's essentially about harming someone as a knower. So denying them credibility or trustworthiness based on things like their social identity or their situation, not their actual knowledge or abilities.
So it's like dismissing someone's expertise just because of who they are
Exactly.
or where they come from.
Yeah, and the philosopher Aidan McGlynn, he argues that this goes deeper than just doubting someone's reliability. It's a value judgment. You're saying, I don't believe you're worthy of trust or respect as a knower.
Right.
So, imagine a woman presents this brilliant idea in a meeting and her male colleagues just dismiss it out of hand.
Oh, yeah.
But later, a man presents the same idea and everyone loves it.
Yeah. Classic example of bias undermining someone's credibility.
Right. And it's not always just about overt prejudice. Sometimes it's more subtle, like tokenism, where someone's included just to tick a diversity box, but not genuinely valued for their expertise.
So even if someone is given a seat at the table, they might still be facing epistemic injustice
Exact.
if their contributions are consistently undervalued or ignored.
Yeah. And this is where I think Catherine Hawley's work is so important.
Okay.
She points out that being trustworthy, it requires this delicate balance, right? Of wanting to commit to things, being able to fulfill those commitments, and knowing when to say no.
Right.
But for people in vulnerable situations, whether that's due to illness, marginalization, or other factors, maintaining this balance can be much, much harder.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're constantly fighting for recognition
Yeah.
or just struggling to meet your basic needs,
Right.
it's going to be tougher to consistently demonstrate trustworthiness,
Right.
even if you have the best intentions.
Exactly. And this leads to the very real but often overlooked connection between trust and mental health.
Okay, I'm ready to go there. What does the editorial have to say about trust in the context of psychological crisis?
Well, Michael Larkin and Zoe Bowden offer a really insightful perspective on this. They argue that untrustworthiness in these cases can stem from relational pain and perceived failures, and it can affect all kinds of relationships, not just those with therapists.
So past hurts and betrayals can make it difficult to trust even people who genuinely want to help.
Exactly. And they share this really powerful story about a patient who doesn't trust her own mother with her suffering.
Wow.
Right. And it's not about the mother's capacity to be supportive. It's more about a way for the patient to protect herself from further pain and disappointment.
That's so powerful because it really gets to the heart of how deeply personal and complex trust can be.
Yeah.
Especially when you factor in past trauma and emotional vulnerability, it makes you realize that sometimes distrust isn't even about the other person's actions.
Right.
It's about protecting ourselves
Yeah.
from further pain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this, I think, highlights this need for a more nuanced understanding of trustworthiness, where sometimes not attributing trustworthiness can actually be a way of coping,
Hmm.
even if it doesn't fit the usual philosophical definitions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
From defining trust to exploring how past experiences and power dynamics can shape trustworthiness.
Yeah.
But before we move on, can we even talk about trust when it comes to like groups and institutions?
That's a great question, and it's one that Catherine Hawley herself grappled with.
Okay.
She was skeptical of whether we can trust groups in the same way that we trust individuals,
Okay.
arguing that groups lack some of the key features that make individual trust possible, like, the ability to voluntarily commit to something or
Right.
take responsibility for their actions.
It is easier to wrap your head around the trustworthiness of a single person
Right.
than like this whole nebulous group.
Yeah,
But haven't there been cases where entire institutions have earned our trust?
absolutely. And the editorial presents a really interesting counter-argument from Matthew Bennett. He says that groups actually do have commitments, right?
Okay.
In the form of shared goals and values.
Right.
So, like, think about a company that pledges to be environmentally responsible,
Okay.
right? If they get caught polluting, it feels like a betrayal of that commitment, even though it's a group entity.
Right. It's not just one person making that decision.
Exactly, yeah. And Bennett argues that violating those group values can lead to the same kind of moral resentment we experience with individual betrayal. Like, if a charity that you support, is found to be misusing funds,
Right.
it feels like a personal letdown.
It feels like they broke a promise to you.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that sense of violated trust shows that it's not just about relying on information or services.
Right.
It's about a deeper commitment to shared values and expectations.
It really is making me rethink how I view trust
Yeah.
in all sorts of groups and institutions,
Right.
from brands I choose to the news sources I rely on.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that trust is a two-way street, right? Whether we're talking about individuals or these larger entities.
This has been such a thought-provoking discussion already, and I am so curious to dive deeper into that institutional side of trust.
We're going to be back after a short break to explore what the editorial has to say about trust in science and how those cognitive institutions that you mentioned play a role in shaping our beliefs and behaviors.
Right, so let's pick up where we left off and really get into how these big ideas about trust play out in the real world, especially when it comes to institutions.
Yes, and I'm particularly fascinated by this whole concept of cognitive institutions that you mentioned earlier. It sounds a bit like something out of the Matrix,
Yeah, it does.
like these invisible structures shaping how we see the world.
It's not that far off. I mean, think about it. You go to the grocery store, to get in line.
Yeah.
There's no giant rule book or anything, but we all sort of understand. That's just how things work. That shared understanding, those unspoken rules, that's a cognitive institution in action.
Okay. That's a really good example. So it's not just about like physical buildings or organizations.
Yeah.
It's more like these shared mental models that we all kind of operate on. Yeah, exactly. And Sean Gallagher and Enrico Petrarca, two of the authors featured in this editorial, they argue that trust is absolutely crucial for these cognitive institutions to function well. They say there needs to be trust both within the institution, so among the people who make it up, and then externally, so between the institution and the public that it serves.
That makes perfect sense. Like,
Yeah.
if I don't trust the legal system to be fair and impartial,
Right.
I'm less likely to cooperate with it, even if I believe in the laws themselves.
Right, exactly. And the same goes for healthcare, education, Government, basically any system that relies on this kind of shared understanding and cooperation, trust is really the glue that holds it all together.
But what happens when that glue starts to weaken? I mean, we've seen a lot of that in recent years
Yeah.
with, growing distrust in science, the rise of conspiracy theories. What does this editorial offer on those trends?
Well, Catherine Furman's article provides a really useful framework, I think, for understanding this distrust. She says it's not simply about, like, a lack of information or understanding. It's really about this complex interplay of beliefs, values, and emotions.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. How do those three things, so beliefs, values, emotions, how do they factor into how we view something like science?
Well, she points out that science itself isn't this purely objective, value-free pursuit. The questions that scientists choose to study, the way they conduct their research, even how they interpret their data, all of that is shaped by values, both individual and societal.
So even before we get to like the findings themselves,
Yeah.
there's already these layers of values influencing the scientific process.
Exactly. And our own personal values then come into play in how we perceive and accept that scientific information. It's natural to be more receptive to findings that align with our existing worldview, right?
Right.
And more skeptical of those that challenge it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like if I strongly believe in individual liberty,
Yeah.
I might be really hesitant to accept scientific evidence that supports government regulation,
Right.
even if the evidence itself is sound.
Exactly. And then you layer on emotions, right?
Right.
Fear, anger, distrust, those feelings, those really powerful feelings can make us less likely to even engage with information rationally,
Yeah.
even if it's coming from a credible source.
It's like, don't confuse me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Right, exactly. Sometimes our emotions just take over, and it's hard to see things clearly. And Furman emphasizes how vulnerability, especially when it's related to things like illness, can really intensify those emotional responses.
Yeah.
I mean, if you or someone you love is sick, you might be more willing to believe in a miracle cure,
Absolutely.
even if it lacks scientific backing, because hope is just so powerful.
That's such a human response, though, right?
Yeah.
When we're desperate, we'll grasp at any shred of hope.
Yeah, and her point is we need to understand this really complex interplay of beliefs, values, emotions. If we want to even begin to address distrust in science effectively, it's not just about throwing more facts at people, right?
Right.
It's about recognizing that trust is built on this much deeper foundation.
It's more about building bridges and understanding where people are coming from
Exactly.
and just trying to win an argument
Yeah.
with logic and data.
Exactly. And this brings us to another fascinating concept that's explored in the editorial, which is called hinge epistemology. And Anna Peternesky, she uses this framework to analyze the dynamics of group distrust.
Okay, hinge epistemology. Sounds a little intimidating,
I
but
guess.
lay it on me.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. I mean, imagine, a house that's built on a shaky foundation. Even if the house itself looks fine on the surface, it's vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Well, our beliefs work in a similar way. They're built upon certain core assumptions, these hinges. And if those hinges are faulty or biased, our whole understanding of the world can get distorted.
So those core beliefs act like a filter, basically,
Yeah.
for how we process information.
Exactly. And Peternesky, she argues that we have this default tendency to trust others, what she calls hinge trust. It's kind of like the starting point for our social interactions. But this trust is fragile. It can be really easily broken by things like bias or negative experiences.
So we're wired to trust, but that trust can be eroded
Yeah,
if we encounter, evidence that contradicts those initial assumptions.
exactly. And she gives this really compelling example. Imagine a group of friends who have this deep-seated bias against women. One of their female friends, Brenda, happens to be a brilliant architect.
Mm.
And she's explaining this complex building design. But because of their bias, the group distrusts her explanation, and they prefer to believe, a less knowledgeable male friend
Oh, wow.
who's just, skimmed a couple articles online.
That's such a good illustration of how bias can completely cloud our judgment. Even when someone is clearly qualified and knowledgeable, it's like that hinge of distrust towards women just overrides any evidence to the contrary.
Exactly. And Peternesky uses this example to explore whether group distrust based on a shared bias can ever be rational.
That's a good question. Is it?
Well, she argues that it's not. She distinguishes between hinges that are genuinely knowledge conducive, right? So those are based on sound reasoning and evidence,
Mm-hmm.
and those that are just, in effect within a particular community, even if they're biased. And because those biased hinges aren't reliable, the group's distrust in Brenda, even though it comes from this shared belief, isn't ultimately justified.
So even though it might feel valid to them,
Right.
because it's based on this shared belief, it's not actually grounded in good reason.
Exactly.
It's evidence.
Yeah. And I think this raises some really important questions about how we identify and challenge those biased hinges that can lead to epistemic injustice and distrust in individuals and groups.
This is all so mind-blowing. We've peeled back the layers of trust and uncovered this really intricate web of beliefs, values, emotions, and even these foundational hinges that shape how we see the world.
Yeah, it really highlights how trust is so much more than just a gut feeling.
Right.
It's really deeply intertwined with our social identities, our experiences, and those often unconscious biases that we carry with us.
Yeah, this is making me rethink how I approach trust in all areas of my life, from personal relationships to the information I consume.
Yeah. And that's the power of these kinds of philosophical deep dives, right?
Yeah,
They challenge us to examine our assumptions and see the world in new ways.
absolutely. This conversation has given me a lot to ponder, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts on what we can do to actually cultivate more healthy and informed trust in a world that often feels so divided and distrustful.
That's a great question, and one that deserves its own deep dive, honestly. But I think a good starting point is simply being aware of these complexities that we've been talking about, right?
Right.
Recognizing that trust is dynamic, contextual, and influenced by this whole host of factors. And I think that can help us approach it with more nuance and understanding.
And maybe a little more humility, too.
Yeah,
Acknowledging that we all have biases and blind spots
absolutely.
can help us be more open to different perspectives
Yeah,
and a little less quick to judge those who hold beliefs that are different from our own.
yeah, exactly. Cultivating that intellectual humility is so crucial in a world that's just overflowing with information
Yes.
and competing narratives.
This has been such an insightful and thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah, it has.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this complex landscape of trust.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, I encourage you to kind of continue exploring these ideas and engage in those thoughtful conversations about trust in your own communities.
This has been an amazing deep dive.
It has.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay curious.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how trust works with people one-on-one, and even in groups.
Yeah.
But now I'm really curious about these big cognitive institutions,
Right.
like science, which many people see as the ultimate source of truth.
Yeah, that's a great point. We often put a lot of trust in science and experts, but it's important to remember that even those institutions, they're made up of people, right?
Yeah.
And people with their own values and perspectives.
And those values can kind of sneak in, right?
Absolutely.
And influence things.
Yeah.
From the questions they ask to how they interpret data.
Exactly. Remember Furman's point about the interplay of beliefs, values, and emotions? Well, that applies to science as well.
So it's even if you could magically remove any intentional bias,
Yeah,
there's still that human element that's just woven into the whole process.
absolutely. And, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Values can be what drives us to ask important questions,
Right.
to do research that benefits humanity. But it's really crucial to be aware of those influences
Right.
so that we can critically evaluate scientific claims, even those that come from, respected sources.
So it's we can't just blindly accept everything a scientist says just because they have a PhD, right?
Right, exactly.
We have to think about it critically, consider potential biases, motivations, all that.
Yeah, and this is where understanding those domains of trust that we were talking about earlier becomes so important. What are we specifically trusting scientists for?
Right.
Are we trusting them to provide objective facts, to solve complex problems, to make ethical decisions about how scientific knowledge is used?
Right. It all depends on what we're expecting them to do.
Exactly. And those expectations, right, that we bring to science can shape how we perceive its trustworthiness. If we expect scientists to always be right, to have all the answers all the time,
Right.
we're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
For sure. And when those expectations aren't met, then it leads to that distrust, not just in the individual scientist, but in science as a whole.
Yeah, and I think it really highlights how crucial it is to have those open and honest conversations about the limitations of science as well as its potential.
So being more transparent
Absolutely.
and communicative, especially when it comes to institutions.
Yeah, transparency and open communication are key. And, this brings us back to those cognitive institutions that we keep talking about.
Right? Those shared mental models that kind of dictate how we see the world.
Right.
So how does trust work within those institutions?
Well, Gallagher and Petrarca, they say these institutions work best when there's a lot of trust, both internally, like among the people who are part of the institution,
Right.
and externally between the institution and the public.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, like, the scientists within a research institution need to trust each other to do ethical and rigorous work.
Exactly.
Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah. And if the public loses trust in scientific institutions, it becomes much harder to deal with these big challenges, like climate change or pandemics.
Right.
People are less likely to accept the science or support policies that are based on it.
So it's not just about scientists doing good work. It's about making sure people trust them, too.
Right, exactly. Building and maintaining that trust isn't just about getting the facts out there.
Right.
It's about having transparency, accountability, ethical conduct within these institutions themselves.
And this goes back to Bennett's point about group commitments, right?
Yeah.
If a scientific organization says, we put public health first, even before profit,
Right.
and then hides information that could hurt their business,
Yeah.
that's a huge violation of trust.
Oh, absolutely. And those kinds of breaches can have a ripple effect, not just for that institution, but for society as a whole.
Because then people start to lose faith in the systems that are supposed to help us find truth and knowledge.
Exactly. And that creates a vacuum that can be filled with misinformation and conspiracy theories and all sorts of things.
This has been such a great deep dive. It really feels like we've gone beyond just what trust is and into how it works in all these different areas of life.
It's been a fascinating conversation for me, too. And I think if there's one thing for listeners to take away, it's that trust isn't passive.
Right.
It's something we all have to work at to build and protect.
Both in our own lives and in the bigger institutions around us.
Exactly.
So what can people do? How can we all navigate this trust issue?
Well, I think the first thing is to be aware of the things that can influence trust, like our own biases and how complex these institutions really are.
And being open to questioning things, looking for different viewpoints,
Exactly.
challenging our own assumptions.
Yeah, that intellectual humility, that healthy skepticism can really help us figure out who and what to trust.
This has been so insightful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, keep thinking about these ideas. Keep the conversation about trust going.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious.